Welcome in, everybody. We're diving into the world of Stax Rosh and his podcast, Dangerous Talk, today. You've sent over a really interesting mix of stuff about him, bioinfo, articles, and of course those 10 episodes of Dangerous Talk. This Rosh guy was a big deal in Philly's secular scene, it seems. Excited to explore his work with you.
Yeah, the range of his experience is pretty remarkable right off the bat. A master's in philosophy, democratic politics, on the board of the Free Thought Society, and he even wrote for places like Huffington Post.
Wow.
Seems like you're interested in how this all comes together in his podcast.
Exactly. It's like, how did he connect all those dots? You mentioned in your notes that you were particularly interested in the community aspect of Rosh's work. So how did he go about creating this sense of community, both within the podcast and maybe beyond it?
That's a good question. Well, Dangerous Talk itself doesn't really lay out specific community organizing stuff. It does create this feeling of shared experience. Rosh directly talks to his listeners. He uses humor, personal stories to make you feel like you're in on a conversation with friends. And I think that probably really clicked with people who maybe felt isolated in their non-belief.
We have 10 episodes of Dangerous Talk here. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. What were the big themes and arguments he presented? He wasn't afraid to tackle some touchy subjects.
Oh, yeah, definitely not. He goes after intelligent design in one episode, using philosophical arguments to kind of pick apart its validity as science. Another one features deconversion stories, people talking about their personal journeys away from religion. Really highlights the emotional and intellectual complexities of that whole experience.
So he's tackling intelligent design, diving into deconversion stories, not shying away from the tough stuff. What stands out to you about those particular episodes?
What really struck me was how Rosh balances serious intellectual discussion with humor. Like in that intelligent design episode, he uses this analogy comparing the complexity of life to a watchmaker needing a watchmaker, and then that watchmaker needing another watchmaker. You get the idea. It just makes a complicated philosophical argument more accessible, more memorable.
You did mention in your notes that you really appreciate his humor. Was there a particular episode or argument where his humor really landed for you?
Oh, for sure. There's this one deconversion story, a former pastor, actually. He describes the moment he realized he didn't believe anymore. He compares it to realizing Santa Claus isn't real, but instead of missing out on toys, it's, eternal salvation that disappears. It's that blend of humor and vulnerability that makes it both funny and really thought-provoking.
So he's weaving humor into these weighty discussions. It seems like a very conscious choice to make these topics more approachable, especially for people who might be questioning their own beliefs.
Oh, definitely. It's like he's creating a safe space, a space where listeners can explore challenging ideas without feeling intimidated or preached at.
Let's zoom out a bit and look at Rosh's own journey. His path from an early interest in philosophy to becoming this leading voice in the secular movement is really fascinating, especially considering the social climate at the time.
Right. Back then, atheism and secularism weren't exactly dinner table conversation topics. Rosh was a pioneer in bringing these conversations into the open, challenging the status quo, and building a platform for like-minded people to connect.
Can you give an example from the material where you felt Rosh's philosophical background was really shining through?
There's this one episode where he goes deep on the concept of free will. He breaks down different philosophical viewpoints, what they mean for morality and personal responsibility. His ability to unpack these dense arguments in a clear and engaging way shows you just how deep his philosophical understanding really was.
And it wasn't just the podcast, right? He was active with the Free Thought Society, writing for big publications, even dabbling in internet radio before podcasts were a thing.
Totally. That shows a real dedication to reaching people, pushing the conversation forward. He wasn't content just talking to people who already agreed with him. He wanted to engage with the wider public, challenge societal norms.
This guy was a multifaceted individual, dedicated to promoting reason and secularism using every tool he could find. And his approach seems to have resonated with more and more people, judging by the rising number of people identifying as atheist or agnostic these days.
Absolutely. It's hard to measure direct influence, but Rosh's work definitely contributed to the growing acceptance and visibility of these perspectives. He gave a voice to people who felt marginalized, and he helped normalize conversations about atheism and non-belief.
It's amazing how he wove his diverse experiences together: philosophy, politics, writing, media, all with this goal of advancing secularism. What aspects of his work do you find most compelling at this point?
His ability to blend serious intellectual stuff with humor, that's what really gets me. He makes complex ideas accessible without dumbing them down. It's a very engaging and thought-provoking experience for the listener. That approach, combined with his obvious passion for these issues, makes his work both entertaining and impactful.
I agree. Making you think while making you laugh, that's a rare gift. We'll take a closer look at his impact and legacy in the next part of our deep dive.
It's fascinating to think about Rosh's legacy, Even though Dangerous Talk only ran for a short time, it seems like it really left its mark on the secular community and beyond. And makes you wonder how his work might connect with someone today, given how much the media landscape and societal attitudes towards atheism have changed.
You've hit on something important there, the evolving media landscape. Rosh was an early adopter, from dabbling in internet radio to his use of blogs and social media. Do you see any parallels between his approach and how secular ideas are spread today?
Definitely. The platforms may be different now, but those core principles, accessibility and engaging storytelling, those are still crucial. Rosh got it, To reach a broader audience, you got to meet people where they are. Use humor, personal stories, plain language to make complex topics relatable.
You've also pointed out this shift in societal attitudes towards atheism. Openly saying you don't believe was much less common back in Rosh's day. Do you think his work played a part in creating a more accepting environment for atheists and secular humanists?
It's tough to say for sure, like cause and effect, but he was definitely part of the conversation. By showing atheists as thoughtful, engaging people, he challenged those stereotypes and helped humanize non-belief. That likely paved the way for more acceptance and understanding.
Along with the podcast episodes, you also sent over some of Rosh's articles. Did you find any connections between the things he explored in writing and in his podcast discussions?
Oh, absolutely. One consistent theme is his critique of the Christian right's influence on politics and society. He digs into their arguments in both his writing and the podcast, points out logical fallacies, and really emphasizes the potential danger of mixing religious dogma with policymaking.
And he does it all with that signature wit we talked about, right?
Yeah.
It seems like humor was a key element in both his written and spoken work.
Exactly. Humor's like this powerful tool to expose hypocrisy, break down rigid thinking. Plus, it makes those potentially heavy topics go down easier for a wider audience. And that satirical edge, well, I know that really resonates with you based on your notes.
It does. I love how he uses humor not just for laughs, but to make a point, get people thinking critically. Thinking about Rosh's legacy today, what lessons can we take from his approach, especially for people who want to have similar conversations about secularism and reason?
There are a few key takeaways. First, you got to meet your audience where they are, use language they understand, examples they can relate to. Second, the power of storytelling, those personal anecdotes, that's how you connect with listeners emotionally. And third, use humor strategically. It can disarm opponents, expose hypocrisy, and make tough conversations way more engaging.
Those are valuable lessons, not just for talking about atheism, but for communicating any complex idea effectively. Rosh was definitely ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
No doubt about it. He was a true pioneer in using new media to reach people and challenge the norm. His legacy still inspires and informs how we talk about secularism and critical thinking in this digital age.
Let's shift gears a bit and focus on a specific aspect of Rosh's work that you found particularly compelling. His willingness to go head-to-head in debates with people who hold opposing views. You included several transcripts of his debates with religious figures, tackling things like the existence of God and religion's role in society. What drew you to those debates?
It was really his ability to stay calm and articulate even when things got heated. He didn't resort to personal attacks or get all emotional. He just dismantled her opponent's arguments with logic, evidence, and even a little bit of humor. It really shows the power of reasoned discussion, even when you disagree.
You mentioned in your notes that you were especially interested in his debate with a prominent intelligent design advocate. What were some of the key points that stuck with you from that exchange?
Rosh just masterfully picked apart the intelligent design argument, showing how it doesn't hold up as a scientific theory. He explained that it relies on gaps in our current scientific knowledge and says, oh, well, a supernatural designer must have filled those gaps instead of looking for natural explanations. He emphasized how that kind of thinking actually stifles scientific inquiry and encourages reliance on faith over evidence.
That's a crucial point. He's not just arguing against a specific belief, he's defending the scientific method itself, advocating for a worldview that's based on reason and critical thinking.
Exactly. He makes this compelling case for why it's so important to keep faith separate from scientific inquiry. Let each one operate in its own realm.
It's impressive, his ability to articulate those complex ideas so clearly and concisely, even in a heated debate. Do you see a connection between his debating style and his overall approach to communicating about atheism and secularism.
Absolutely. That commitment to reason, evidence-based arguments, and respectful dialogue, it's there in everything he does, whether he's hosting his podcast, writing an article, or going toe-to-toe in a debate. He lives the principles he advocates for, which makes him such a powerful and persuasive advocate for secular values.
Let's explore another dimension of Rosh's legacy now, something you specifically highlighted in your notes: his impact on the atheist and secular community. You said you were drawn to his work because it helped you feel less alone in your non-belief. Can you tell us more about that?
Growing up in a pretty religious community, I often felt like I didn't belong because I didn't believe. Finding Rosh's podcast, it was like a light bulb moment. Hearing him put into words the doubts and questions I'd been wrestling with, it made me feel seen, like someone understood. His work gave me a sense of belonging. It showed me there's a whole community out there, people who share my worldview.
That's such a powerful testament to the impact he had, not just on the intellectual landscape, but on the lives of individuals who connected with his message. That ability to create a sense of community through his work, that's something we can all learn from.
Definitely. He understood how important it was to build connection and solidarity, especially for people who might feel marginalized or isolated because of their beliefs. His work was like a beacon, bringing people together, creating a space for shared experiences and support.
His legacy goes way beyond arguments and debates. It's about creating belonging, empowering people to embrace their non-belief with confidence. It's a really beautiful and lasting contribution to the secular movement.
Absolutely. He reminds us that we're not alone, that there's strength in numbers, and that together we can build a world where reason, compassion, and critical thinking are the guiding principles. It's a vision worth fighting for, and Rosh's work gives us a roadmap to get there.
Before we jump into the final part of our deep dive, I'd love to hear your thoughts on one more aspect of Rosh's work: his involvement with the Free Thought Society of Greater Philadelphia. You mentioned you were particularly interested in the Society's activism and community outreach. What were some of the specific examples from the source material that stood out to you?
One that comes to mind is their campaign against religious displays on public property. They argued for the separation of church and state and the importance of keeping the public sphere secular. The society organized protests, filed lawsuits, and did public education campaigns to raise awareness about the constitutional issues involved.
That's Rosh's belief in action, right? He wasn't content just talking about these things. He wanted to make a real difference in the world.
Exactly. His commitment to activism shows that promoting secular values goes beyond just intellectual debates. You have to engage in the public square, fight for change, and defend everyone's right to live in a society free from religious coercion.
That commitment to action, that's an inspiring part of Rosh's legacy. He reminds us that advocating for reason and secularism takes both thoughtful discussion and courageous action.
Absolutely. He sets a great example for all of us. He urges us to speak out against injustice, challenge dogma, and work hard to create a world where reason and compassion guide our choices. His legacy lives on not just in his words, but in the actions he inspired.
As we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and engaging with this material in such a thoughtful way. Your perspective has really enriched our understanding of Stax Rosh's work and why it still matters today.
It's been my pleasure. It's been great to revisit his work and explore its impact with you. His legacy continues to inspire and challenge us to think critically, have meaningful conversations, and advocate for a world where reason and secular values can flourish. You know, one thing that really stood out to me was Rosh's ability to connect things that seem totally different. Like, he drew these parallels between the Salem witch trials and those kind of modern-day moral panics we see.
Interesting. So he's using history as a lens to understand what's happening today.
Exactly. He argued that both those things, the witch trials and those moral panics, they come from the same place, fear, ignorance, lack of critical thinking.
Yeah, that lack of critical thinking can be a dangerous thing for sure.
Oh, totally. And he gave some really striking examples of this from more recent history, too.
Like what?
Well, in one episode, he compares the McCarthy era, the whole communist witch hunt thing, to how Muslims and other minorities are sometimes targeted today based on nothing but fear and stereotypes.
Oh, that's a heavy comparison.
It is, and it's meant to be. Rosh argues that both of those things, McCarthyism and the stuff we see today, it shows how dangerous unchecked power can be, how blind faith can erode our civil liberties in the name of security, like trading freedom for safety.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. It's like history doesn't always teach us the lessons it should.
Right, and Rosh is always hammering home that point. Critical thinking, healthy skepticism of authority, those are the keys to making sure we don't repeat the worst parts of history.
I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something you specifically mentioned in your notes, Rosh's advocacy for the separation of church and state. You said you were particularly interested in his analysis of the Christian right and their efforts to influence public policy with their religious beliefs.
Yeah, Rosh really gets into it with that. He dissects their arguments like surgically, and he shows how they try to twist the idea of religious freedom into this freedom to impose their beliefs on everyone else.
Which kind of defeats the purpose of freedom.
All right. Exactly. And Rosh argued that this interpretation, it undermines the whole idea of a pluralistic society, a democracy even. Like, it's a recipe for disaster.
You also mentioned his legal analysis. He was really sharp on that, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, very much so. In a lot of his writing, he cites Supreme Court rulings that uphold the separation of church and state, like showing how that principle is woven right into American law. And he breaks it down, explains the logic behind those rulings, debunks all the ways the Christian right tries to twist them to fit their agenda.
It's clear he knew his stuff when it came to the Constitution and religious freedom. He used that knowledge to really shut down those who wanted to mix religion and government.
It's like he saw it as his duty, to protect the rights of all citizens, no matter what they believed or didn't believe.
It's a pivotal fight for sure. Okay, let's get a little more personal for a minute. I want to talk about Rosh's focus on the individual's journey. You mentioned you found his discussions of deconversion especially relatable. Tell me more about that. Why did those stories resonate with you?
Well, I went through a deconversion myself, and hearing those stories Rosh shared, it was like, whoa, other people feel this too. He created this space where people could talk about their experiences, the emotions, the intellectual struggles. Leaving behind something that was such a big part of your life, it's not easy.
Yeah, that can be a really tough and lonely journey.
It can be. And what Rosh did, it was like he gave us a roadmap. And he emphasized the importance of reason and critical thinking during that process.
So it's not about throwing reason out the window, it's about embracing it even more.
Yeah. He framed deconversion not as some failure of faith, but as a victory for reason. He encouraged people to embrace their doubts, question everything, and follow the evidence wherever it leads. It's a very empowering message.
It's not about rejecting something, it's about discovering something new. Like a worldview grounded in reason, evidence, and the freedom to choose for yourself.
That's it. Rosh helped make deconversion normal, Just showed it wasn't weak or rebellious. It's just being honest with yourself and committed to truth.
And he provided a lifeline for people who might have felt alone, even judged, for changing their beliefs.
Absolutely. His work built community. It's like, you're not in this alone. We're all figuring it out together.
That's such a powerful legacy to leave behind. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Stacks Rosh, I want to thank you again for sharing your insights and for being such a thoughtful guide through all this material. It's been a real pleasure exploring his work with you.
The pleasure was all mine. Rosh was a truly remarkable figure, and his legacy continues to inspire us to think critically, to question everything, and to keep fighting for a more just and equitable world.
And on that note, I want to thank all of you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Stacks Rosh. We hope you found it enlightening, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep those minds open and those questions coming.